Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jennie Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Dianne Hartshorn.
It is officially November.
Yes, it is.
We had a lovely, lovely live event on October 31st, so Halloween.
Yeah, that was fun. That was a lot of fun. So I can't wait till we do it again.
I know. I really enjoyed being able to chat with our listeners and answer their questions, and we got to show off our new merchandise. So
Hmm.
if you weren't able to join us on the 31st, and we know there's a lot of folks who didn't because it was Halloween, of course, and if you have kids, you were out trick-or-treating, or maybe you're in one of those neighborhoods where you get a ton of trick-or-treaters. We actually had a lot of trick-or-treaters at our house. Dave and Charlie were nice enough at one point to kind of go out on the porch to handle the influx so that they wouldn't ring the doorbell too often since we were doing our
Oh,
live. Which I wasn't going to mind if the doorbell had rung while we were recording for that because it was a holiday and one of my favorite holidays and all of that. But it was nice of them to do that. And fortunately, because it had been really cold the day before, but then it
yes.
warmed up so that it wasn't freezing cold on Halloween. So I think after it got dark, our temperatures were like in the high 40s, low
Oh,
50s somewhere.
that's pretty good for us for Halloween.
Yeah.
So,
So I noticed, and after we were done recording, and the few times I answered the door after that, like trick or treaters were, I could see their costumes. So they weren't all
mm,
bundled up, which was
cool.
great. Because some years, it gets really cold and snowy, and then you have to wear your coat over your costume and
Mhm. That's no
kind of
fun.
defeats it. But they started early at our house. Our first group came before 6 o'clock, before we started recording.
Oh,
Those
before,
were
yeah.
it was like a group of families that were trick-or-treating together, and I think those children were all like preschool and younger. They were so cute, and I think they were trying to get their trick-or-treating in before it got dark.
Well, that
So
makes sense, and that was something that people were saying that since they do a lot of trunk and treat or whatever that is,
yes.
that a lot of people are missing the trick-or-treaters, and that was the other thing I was going to tell you. I'll tell you after the call. But yeah, so I'm glad you got to enjoy that because I know how much you like that.
Yes, we're very fortunate. We have a lot of families in our neighborhood. I also think we get families. There's some apartments not too far from us. So I think sometimes we get
Mhm.
families from those apartments that drive over here because it's a safer neighborhood and they feel like they can bring their kids. And that's
Yeah.
great because I'm like, take all the candy that I buy. We had a little leftover, but I wasn't inundated with it. So that was great.
Oh, I already ate 2 bags of Kit Kat, so
Yeah.
yeah, by
Well,
myself.
and our last few groups of kiddos were older kids, and I was
Yeah.
like handfuls into their bags. I'm like, just take it, go.
Better you than me. Better on you than me. So
Right?
yeah.
I was like, you guys are young, you can still process all of this sugar more efficiently than I can. So take it all. So we do have a little bit left over, but not much. But of course, I always buy candy that I know we'll eat if there's leftovers. So
Well, yeah, or sometimes we'll buy, yeah, the ones we don't eat to make sure we don't eat them, but I don't even see those anymore, like suckers and stuff. And I'll still eat those. So, or,
well, and now that my own kids aren't going out trick or treating, it's not like they're bringing candy in. So
hmm.
the leftovers, that's our trick or treat candy now. So whatever's left over. So now that we're officially on to November, we have decided this month we are going to try and feature episodes in one way or another where we can talk about being thankful for something.
Yes.
So, and because we're thankful for something, our first thing that we are thankful for is those listeners who were able to join us on Halloween for our live.
That was fun.
Uh, it was fun. There were some technical glitches, but we made it through that, and I think we have a better understanding of how that whole system works for a future live. So we'll keep you guys posted when we do that. But we were also very grateful because we were able to then share our new merchandise with you. So if you weren't with us on the 31st, we now have an actual
We have a
merchandise set
store.
up. We have a store. It's on Etsy. So I'll put the links in the show notes. And I still need to add the link to our website. I forgot to do that. I realized we have the link for the tea that we announced a couple weeks ago, but I didn't put the link for our Etsy shop. But in the Etsy shop, you guys can now, if you'd like, purchase t-shirts, hoodies, tumblers, coffee mugs, stickers, and tote bags. So we have all of those available with our logo. If you're purchasing the t-shirts or the hoodies, you get the logo on the front. So it says the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery podcast on the front of your shirt. And on the back, it has our opening tagline where every life had a death and every death had a story. So that's on the back. But like I said, there's the tumblers and the coffee mugs and everything. And then, of course, we have the tea, and we will be adding the tea to the Etsy shop. We have just the small sample tins will be added to our Etsy shop. But then we still have the link if you want to get the bigger sizes for that tea until that particular supply of that flavor runs out. And then we will create a new flavor. This one's really our fall sampling that we came up
Yeah.
with. So we'll probably come up with something new for after Thanksgiving going into Christmas, and we'll keep you guys updated on that as we do that. But it was so great to chat with so many of you in person. It was fun because we had listeners from all across the country. We had somebody from Canada, and I think we had somebody from New Zealand that joined us for a short time.
Oh,
So
that is so cool.
it was very cool to have that chat for, with everybody for a little bit. And because we were talking about Canada, we had mentioned in that episode that, we've been able to cover a lot of cemeteries in a lot of places, and we've done some Canadian cemeteries, but not a lot. So this week, we are actually featuring a Canadian cemetery because it got me to thinking about the fact that we hadn't done much with Canada. And so I thought, well, why don't we go visit our neighbors this week? And so I started looking at some Canadian cemeteries, and the one that we're featuring today is very interesting. And so again, keep in mind that today's topic is about being thankful. Today's story is actually quite tragic on a lot of levels, but there are some bright spots in it and some things to be thankful for. And so our cemetery today that we are featuring out of Canada is the St. Martin in the Woods Cemetery, which the whole reason it exists is because it is a plane crash site. And the victims who died on site were buried right there where the crash happened. So the crash, yes. And so it created a cemetery that didn't exist before this moment. So the crash took place on September 18th, 1946, and it is considered the first worldwide major civilian airline crash of an airplane. And it took place near Gander, Newfoundland. So 27 of the 44 people aboard lost their lives, 26 within that day of the crash when it happened. The 27th victim succumbed to their wounds a few days later in the hospital. Fortunately, of the survivors, that was the only one who wasn't able to make it over that healing lump. The rescue operation made history as the first worldwide operation to utilize helicopters in a civilian aviation disaster, something I don't even think we think about anymore when there's any kind of major rescue involving helicopters, because we use them so much for that. But at the time, helicopters were still a new concept. So this was the first time they were used in a rescue. The 26 victims who died at the crash site, as we said, were buried at that site. And then 2 were later removed by family and reinterred in Belgium, which was their home country. And this became the St. Martin in the Woods Cemetery. And it was named for the doctor who dedicated several tireless days and nights to saving those who were rescued. So that's how they came up with the name.
That is absolutely amazing. Newfoundland forms the most easterly province of Canada, bordering the Labrador Sea. In 1936, construction began on Gander International Airport. On January 11th, 1938, the first airplane landed at Gander. Within a few years, it was the largest international airport, having 4 paved runways.
Think about that for just a second. 4 paved runways, it was the largest.
Yeah,
I mean, when we
exactly.
think about the international airports, at least the ones I've flown to, like DIA here in Denver, or there's Boston and Chicago and Georgia and Switzerland, all of these airports that have, I don't know how many runways each of them have, but definitely more than 4. So 4 paved runways is not very big, but aviation was still a pretty new way to travel at this point.
Right, yeah. This is before, World War II, so 1938. So it was, flying was very, very new. So
definitely.
With the onset of World War II in September 1939, Gander Airport was strategically positioned to play a vital role in the war effort. As the only operational airport in the Maritimes, Gander became the primary hub for Allied aircraft deployments to Europe. Gander's location on the Great Circle route made it an ideal wartime refueling and maintenance depot for bombers flying overseas. In 1942, the Newfoundland government handed over the control of the airport to the Canadian government, and it became a military airfield. with a continuous delivery of planes to the war zone.
And if you don't know much about the Canadian Newfoundland history, Newfoundland was kind of its own province for a long time. They weren't actually part of Canada until later, even though they're on the Canadian coast. But
Well, they're pretty remote, I think, given
right, because it's
that
like that
time. Yeah.
northeasterly section of Canada, all the way up there.
After World War II, passenger travel surged to new levels. When wartime travel restrictions ended, airlines were overwhelmed with passengers. In 1955, for the first time, more people in the United States traveled by air than by train. And then there probably wasn't even that much automobile traffic if if they put train in there as the other factor.
Yeah.
Oh, train travel is so nice though. Anyway, by 1957, airliners had replaced ocean liners as the preferred means of crossing the Atlantic. In 1945, the Newfoundland government took over control of the airport again, and by the 1950s, Gander landed 13,000 aircraft annually and 250,000 passengers. Wow.
Yeah. So that's just a brief overview of the airport where this was all supposed to take place, or where this plane was supposed to land, and just sort of their history and how big this was. But also going back to trains, I wish we would bring train travel back more.
Oh, I agree.
No
Especially
offense
along the
to the
front range.
airlines. I know they do their best, especially the staff on board and everything. They try and make everybody comfortable, but I would love to travel cross country on a plane or on a train just as easily as you travel on a plane.
Oh, you know what? Maybe that's what we do when we travel.
I would love it. I think, even if it took an extra 2 days or 1 or 2 days to get to where I'm going from, coast to coast, I would love that chance to see more of the country that way. Like, think about it. You're on the train, you can look out the windows, you're seeing the country as it passes by, right? All our different landscapes, everything. And yes, you see some of that a little bit when you're flying, but only as you're coming in and taking off, right? Once you get to a certain
Yep.
altitude, you're only seeing clouds in the sky, and it's harder to see what's there. So I think it would be so cool if train travel made a big comeback. And it's still sort of available, but not like it was once upon a time.
Oh no, but I mean, maybe that's how we plan our cemetery trips. We do
That would be so fun.
we go by train.
Go by
Okay,
train.
that's
I
it.
love it.
We're going by train. Anyway.
So for this particular incident, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, it took place on September 18th, 1946. And the type of plane being flown was called a Sabina DC-4. And this was a big a big aircraft that had 4 engines. It departed Brussels on Tuesday, September 17th, headed for New York. It had 2 refilling stops that would be required. So now our jets and our engines are big enough that, especially for overseas, usually you can get from whatever country you're leaving from, like America, to your country of origin before they have to land. But when our airplanes were still sort of a new thing and this travel idea was becoming, they had to refuel. So there were multiple stops for these big planes. So the 2 refueling stops would be required, one in Shannon, Ireland, and one in Gander, Newfoundland, before it actually got to New York. After the Shannon stop, the DC-4 headed westward over the North Atlantic. At 4:57 a.m. on Wednesday, September 18th, the captain contacted Gander for approach to clearance. Gander advised him that their weather was below minimus, which I went and double checked the definition for that. I mean, you can kind of guess what it means, but I wanted to make sure we knew, not being pilots. Weather conditions that are below minimus requirements for safe landing or takeoff. And in this case, it was super, super foggy. So the visibility was really poor for the pilots to be able to see. And it just was not the ideal landing conditions, especially in these older planes. So they'd actually closed the field at the airport at Gander, and the flights that had been able to land earlier were grounded at this point. So Gander advised that the DC-4 divert to a nearby field that was still open.
Okay, can you imagine that? Because like you said, at the time, they had to have fueling stops. So it's not like, oh, it's foggy over here. Let's just go over to where, there was no other places for them to go. Oh God, that must have been terrifying.
And that does actually play a part in this whole disaster, is the fact that they couldn't land for fueling.
Like, we just don't think about planes running out of gas now.
Nope.
By 10:57 a.m., all hope for the safe arrival of the DC-4 at the alternate was gone, which was the field that Jennie had mentioned. It had exceeded its calculated fuel endurance. 44 passengers were down in the sea or in the hospitable Newfoundland woods. The airport's emergency response plan swung into action. Due to the extremely poor flying condition, only grounded teams could initially search for the missing plane. Later that afternoon, the weather slightly cleared, allowing a single search plane to take off. To avoid collisions, only one plane was allowed in the search area. Even with the, quote, improved weather, conditions remained challenging: low clouds, icing, and almost zero visibility. Lieutenant Commander Jim Schrader flew the search plane, a PBY, a type of seaplane used for maritime patrol, reconnaissance, and search and rescue operations. 5 crashes were spotted through holes in the fog. All were checked out and determined to be World War II wrecks. Darkness and poor visibility made further search by air impossible that night.
So yeah, they were trying really, really hard. As soon as they realized that plane had run out of fuel, that it was not hopeful that it probably made a safe landing somewhere, they were immediately like got into motion. But again, and if you're on YouTube with us, you can actually see behind me a photo of the cemetery, actually behind both of us. But the one behind me, you can see the where it's really overgrown and stuff. And these woods in Newfoundland are extremely dense, and there's a lot of trees, there's a lot of growth, and they're real close together. So, it's not like they could just go outside and be like, oh, there it is. The fact that they spotted 5 other wrecks that were related to the war that had just ended a year before kind of tells you how dense these woods were and made the search really difficult. So the survivors later testified that shortly after the plane went down, it burst into flames because it hit the fuselage. And so it just went right up. Clad only in what they had escaped in, the survivors were super cold and wet. One of them, a Miss Helen Ruth Henderson, was a Girl Scout executive. I had to throw that in there, being a lifelong Girl Scout. She helped start a fire for warmth and signal. And she was extremely injured, but she took into account her training as a Girl Scout and was like, we have to start a fire. We have to get the signal going. We're going to make this happen. Later, they would lay out a large number, 18 in stones, to inform rescuers of how many of them were still alive. Of those 18, only 3 of them did not have serious injuries. And it was those 3 at this point that were mainly trying to keep everybody alive and going, keeping their spirits up. And again, this is Newfoundland, so you're way up north in Canada. Mm-hmm. It's September, so it's going to be cold, especially at night. It's not far off the coast, so you're getting that fog and the wet weather. The conditions were not ideal for being in. And they probably, because they were traveling that time of year, did have some coats and stuff, but they weren't prepared for being out in the elements for an extended.
No, exactly. They just had, like you said, they just had their coats. They didn't have the equipment to survive, out in the elements.
Right. And the most disheartening part of this is when they realized later is they could hear planes flying over them, going back and forth to the airport, and probably some of them trying to search for them as well. But because of the foggy conditions, they couldn't see each other. So even with their signaling efforts with the fire and everything, it was still too dense for these planes to recognize that this is where the survivors were.
Oh my goodness. The Sun-Times on Thursday, September 19th, 1946, Thursday morning, the skies were brilliantly clear in the airport area, and searching planes were able to make a thorough coverage of the wooded district near the field. Captain Ray Jennings, flying another DC-4 inbound to Gander, spotted not only the crash, but survivors waving coats. Oh, I can't imagine what both of them must have felt.
And I'm assuming these other planes like this were not part of the search thing, but they'd probably heard about the crash at this point.
Well, like they said, they can only let one up at a time. It's not like we have the technology and the radar like we do today, so they can see each other, The crash was located 24 miles southwest of Gander. Some reports state 22 miles, some 29. Either way, it was a ways.
I thought I'd include all of them because I was reading different reports, and some were like 22, 24, 29, within 30 miles.
Yeah, which is quite a distance if you're searching that through fog.
Right. And dense woods.
Yeah, and they didn't have like devices. I don't think they had devices on the planes in those days that you could, I don't want to say ping it like we can our
No, there was no
cell phones, for
GPS or
God's
anything
sakes.
like that.
Yeah.
So,
The site was heavily wooded and would not be easy to reach. Orders were given to parachute survival gear, medical supplies, and especially sleeping bags to the survivor while a rescue plan was formed. So that was good. The afternoon, two hunters reached the site, Abbott Pelly and Bruce Shea. They remained with the survivors until more help arrived.
yeah. And they didn't even know anything about the crash at that point because they'd been out they were caribou hunting, which
Yeah,
I find fun only because we don't do that in the US. We
right.
don't really have caribous, but they were out and they came across the survivors. So they were two able bodied men that had some supplies with them that could help. And they did. And I thought that was very cool. And there's actually, I think it was a radio interview with the two of them that was done later where they were super surprised about what they came across.
Oh,
And the
can you
other
imagine? Yeah.
thing that I didn't really put on the thing, but when Captain Ray Jennings spotted the survivors waving their coats, I think he initially reported 5, and then at some point somebody else that thought there were 7. They didn't realize because they couldn't see the stones that the survivors had initially set up that said 18. So they didn't think there were as many survivors as there were initially. They were thinking there were only at like 3 or 5 or 7
What they could
different
see.
reports.
Yeah.
Because that's all they could see. And those were probably the survivors who were able to actually stand up and move around. So many of them were too injured to be able to do that. So that's the other reason that they only saw those few. The most efficient plan to reach the survivors would entail flying a land rescue party comprised of U.S. Army personnel and Newfoundland woodsmen under the command of U.S. Army Dr. Captain Samuel Martin to uncharted pond stream or to an uncharted pond upstream of the crash site that would be large enough to permit the landings and takeoffs of those PBYs. So that same type of plane that was used in the initial search. And after landing, they would then deploy downstream in rubber boats to the crash site, but they would still be about 5 miles away from the initial crash site. And then, so they would have to do this over and over again, right? So before this mission was complete, these PBYs would make 19 of these landings in an attempt to get personnel and supplies to the crash site. So for the first one, while Dr. Martin and his team rafted downstream, the PBYs continued to circle overhead and tracking their progress, and they were also trying to guide them by radio to a point where they could beach their rafts, climb uphill, and get to the actual crash site. So they were relying on like walkie-talkies to tell them where to go from down below. But it was still tricky because, again, even though the newspaper reported that the weather was all clear and sunny, it really wasn't. They were still having a lot of visibility issues, even with this. So there were times when these PBYs are circling overhead, trying to tell the people in the rafts where they were going, but couldn't actually see much to tell them where to go. So it was a lot of guesswork on what was going on in the air and on the ground.
Well, too, if it's that dense and you're down in the water, and the plane, you would assume the plane would be up on higher land, and they probably were surrounded by trees and brush and everything else that they would not have seen it from the stream, river, whatever it was. So,
and I think part of some of what they knew they were still within sight of their planes because they could hear them, even if they couldn't see them. But they, again, the pilots are trying to give them landmarks and stuff that they're seeing from above. But if the fog rolled in just right, they were like, well, we got to wait to tell you what's next because you can't see it. So you've got a time crunch because you're trying to get to these survivors and they still don't know how severe the injuries are or anything like that. It's not like there were cell phones for the survivors to relate back what was going on. So they're struggling and trying to do this. Finally, at about 7 p.m. on Thursday, Dr. Martin and his team reached the crash site. So they got their rafts, they beached them, and they were able to hike up to the thing. They wasted no time in setting up tents and providing the survivors with the first shelter from the elements that they'd had in 2 days. So they spent 2 days completely unsheltered. At that point, the walkie-talkies that had guided them all day decided to die, and they would not be able to reestablish any contact until the next morning.
Oh my God. Dr. Martin was concerned survivors could not make the trip upstream due to the nature of injuries, severe burns, broken necks, backs, and more. And also paddling upstream, or I guess these were bigger boats, isn't the easiest thing to do. It
Well, and
was
these were rafts. These were like rubber rafts.
okay. So
And
yeah, that would be very, very difficult.
yes, and they still would have had to carry them 5 miles to the rafts overland, then put them in the raft, then paddle upstream to get them back to, a place where they could
Right.
put them on a plane and get them to a hospital. So yeah, he was realizing with the severity of injuries that if they tried to do that, people would not survive that.
Exactly. So it was decided to attempt a rescue using helicopters. This was a brand new idea as helicopters had only been in use for about 4 years. The only operational rescue helicopters were in the United States, were located at two East Coast Guard air stations. These helicopters were small and did not have speed or range to fly to Gander in time to be of any assistance. This is freaking amazing.
It's
They were
so amazing.
disassembled, flown into the area by larger planes first, and then reassembled. They also had to be modified to attach litters that would be lowered to the crash site. I don't know why I'm doing this by hand, but anyway,
I
I
no, I
talk
did
with
the
my
same thing when
hands.
I was reading about it. I was like, oh, so because you see it like coming down
Yes.
to
Oh my
pick them
God.
up. Uh-huh.
The planes landed in Gander at 12:30 a.m. on Saturday. It was dark. It's not like, imagine doing this. Well, I'm sure there were some lights, but not like the floodlights and all the stuff, we
Right.
have today. God, the mechanics had the helicopters modified and reassembled within 6 hours. It's amazing. By 3:12 p.m., the first helicopter was on site to accept the first survivor, stewardess Janine Rookie. She wanted her passengers to be rescued first, pointing to her wings and cuff stripe. But Dr. Martin insisted she be taken. She was the first ever commercial airline crash survivor to be rescued by helicopter.
And there was a whole other story that was dedicated to her that was published in a magazine about a year later. And I'll have links to all of this in the show notes because there's some really fascinating stuff that obviously we can't really include here. But if you're wanting to know more about some of the survivors and stuff, definitely check out these links. But yeah, she was very insistent that she shouldn't be the first one to go because her passengers should go first. It was her
Mhm.
duty to take care of the passengers, and the doctor's like, "Nope, I got them. You go. You need to get out of here." And the other thing with that reassembly within that 6 hours, so at one point somebody had said, how long do you think this is going to take? And at first they were like, we can have it ready by tomorrow morning. And they're like, then don't even bother because by then people are going to start dying. And so I guess the group of mechanics that was doing this, they were just like, nope, we're going to get this done. And 6 hours later, they had those helicopters fully reassembled. They had completely altered the front end, like the bulbous front end part, so they could attach those leaders and created a space where they'd be able to pull them up through so that they could then transport them to wherever I think they went back to the airport, and then from the airport they transported them to the
Amazing.
hospital nearby. But just the fact that they've rebuilt
Yeah,
an entire helicopter, and granted it wasn't as extravagant or fancy today's helicopters, but still 6 hours.
still, yeah, that's amazingly, um, just amazing.
Yeah, so that first helicopter managed to remove 8 of the survivors before dark that night. On Sunday, both helicopters, because they were still reassembling the second one too. So that first one and the second one. So on Sunday, both helicopters were used to fly out the remaining survivors, plus the 14 members of the Army ground rescue team that were already there, and several other people that had come along. And they got all of them evacuated out of the site by Sunday afternoon. After all the survivors had been flown out, the investigators and the officials of the airline were flown in by those same helicopters so they could start their investigation. It was then made at that time, the decision was made to bury the victims near the site crash because of the risk involved of trying to transport the bodies back to Gander. It was hard enough to get the people that were still
Right.
alive out of there, let alone trying to take the dead out. A special aerial funeral service attended by Father P.J. McCarthy, the Reverend Leonard Wolfrey, and a Jewish rabbi from New York was held. And the committal service was performed on board a United States Air Force DC 3 that circled the crash site as they did the service.
Oh my God, it almost makes me want to cry.
Oh, it's even more touching because recordings of the service were made at Gander and later sent to the grieving relatives in Belgium who had requested that a proper burial ceremony take place. So, I mean, they had men on the ground that dug the graves and interred the actual bodies, but they did a beautiful ceremony up in the air to make sure. And they included all of the religions because a good majority of them were Jewish or Roman Catholic, but there were a few other religions available or on board as well. And it was because of the untiring efforts of Major Martin, the doctor, that the survivors named the small cemetery where those 26 victims of the crash site were laid to rest, the St. Martin's in the Wood Cemetery. Many of these passengers on board were rich diamond merchants from Amsterdam who were on their way to New York for a diamond exposition.
Those who call St. Martin's in the Woods their final resting place include Joseph Ulster, 35 years old, married, diamond dealer. Anne F. Woisillon, 39 years old, widowed, secretary. Janine M. Brulant, 31 years old, single, air hostess. Rose M. Dashcott, 41 years old, single. Richard L. Devok, I hope I'm saying that right, 41 years old, married, a manager. Albert E. Joshart, 31 years old, married, first officer. Franz Dupont, 63 years old, married, engineer. Albert Dumont, 63 years old, married, director.
Jacques Dutacht, 32 years old, married, radio officer. Jean Esther, 26 years old, married, captain. He was the captain of the plane. Adolf Fassbender, 47 years old, married, engineer officer. Isabel Heinrichot, 14 years old, student. Raymond Leibert, 43 years old, married, manufacturer. Nathan Leidenbaum, 41 years old, married, merchant. Nellie Lowenthal, 35 years old, married. Henri Paul Weiss, 56 years old, married, president of trade union.
Marie H. W. Pierre, 39 years old, divorced. Marie J. J. A. Pereira, 19 years old, student. Hubert J., 73 years old, consul of Norway, and Louisa R. Reynarts, 56, old, relocated to burial grounds in Belgium in 1948.
So they were a husband and wife.
Lily Report Leynertz, 62 years old, married and a housewife. Laurent G. Shines, 60 years old, married and a diamond expert.
Leopold C.J. Verstraeten, 25 years old, single, navigation officer. Waschberger Gomers, 45 years old, widowed, delegate. Mary M. Wilson, 54 years old, secretary, and William M. Wilson, 55 years old, attorney. And I was able to get all of those details because the death certificates are available through Ancestry. So I was able to look at each individual death certificate to find out their full names, if they had an occupation listed, where they were actually from. Most of them were either residents of New York or Belgium.
Yeah.
And again, if they were family or not.
Several of the victims, both survivors and deceased, had been victims of the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
The staff at Gander's Sir Frederick Banty Memorial Hospital worked around the clock to tend to the needs of the injured. Dr. James Patton, the only doctor available, initially remained on his feet for 48 hours straight and was later awarded a citation by the Belgian government in recognition for his services above and beyond the call of duty. The staff of the hospital were boistered by many residents of the town who offered their services in a volunteer capacity.
So this hospital where they were taken was a very small hospital. And as it says, Dr. James Patton was the only doctor on site at the time, and he had 3 nurses to help him. So there were other residents in town who came in and helped as nurses and aides and whatever they could do. And a couple of them, there was one story I read, she was a nurse, but not at that hospital, but she went up there and she spent the next several days using those nursing skills to help with all these
Wow.
injured patients. So at the time, we said this before, it was the largest commercial airline crash in history. And so this made big headlines. And I was able to find several articles related to it in various newspapers from Canada throughout the US. Teams of journalists and reporters were flown to Gander to provide a firsthand account. The first live radio broadcast to emanate from Newfoundland to the mainland took place as these reporters filed direct radio reports to the respective networks. So that had never happened in Newfoundland before until this accident. And another radio effort like this wasn't repeated again until Newfoundland became a Canadian province 2.5 years later.
The remains of the plane, obviously, are still at the site. A concrete memorial topped by the front place propellers with bronze markers explaining what happened, and lists of those who died and survived. The individual graves are marked by white crosses, which is in the picture behind Jennie, with bronze name markers. And it's still very remote and overgrown and still difficult to reach.
So yes, if you're with us on YouTube, you can see behind both of us an up close photo of the memorial itself that was placed under the propeller of the plane. And you can kind of see it in the picture behind myself. There's a further back picture, so you can see the individual graves and you can see the plane and how that propeller is resting atop that memorial. So they're all, with the exception of the one couple that was taken back to Belgium, they've all been left there. Nobody else is buried in that cemetery. It's strictly the victims of the plane crash that are buried there. But the things that relate this back to being thankful. So there's a lot of things. There were, amazingly, for the type of airplane it was, we didn't have all the safety features yet that airplanes have today. There's a chance if it had been a more modern plane, there would have been more survivors, possibly. Because this went up in flames so quickly, maybe not. One of the descriptions I was reading was talking about how some of the deceased were actually found in the trees and stuff, which is typical at crash sites like this. But the fact that they still had 18 people survive. The only surviving crew member was the one stewardess who was the first one to be taken away from the site. The rest of the crew did perish in that particular fight. But it really propelled the use of helicopters as an aerial device that could do more than just like fly over a site and check things out. Like you could use these helicopters. And from there, it helped engineers and stuff design better helicopters for rescue missions. And now, again, like we said before, we use helicopters all the time in rescue missions. I know in Colorado, we see it a lot when somebody gets stuck up in the mountains,
Exactly.
those hikers that get lost and struck. A lot of times they're rescued because a helicopter can fly into those areas and drop down the equipment or rescuers to get them back up on site. We see them used in cases of like even major accidents, car accidents, stuff like that, to airlift people to a hospital more quickly than you can get through streets in a vehicle, in an ambulance or whatever. So, and it really changed the way helicopters were used in like Vietnam and Korea when those conflicts were happening. Those helicopters were bigger, safer, and could actually haul injured soldiers and stuff out of areas and get them to medical locations more quickly.
Much quicker,
if you've ever watched MASH, that's how the show opened. You see the helicopter flying over the site in Korea where they're bringing in the injured. So it really was that moment when we were like, oh, brilliant idea. We'll just use these helicopters because they cover as opposed to flying over. And there were so many men who had to think so quickly on their feet in this particular case. All those mechanics that disassembled and reassembled. Like they brought the crews from the US to Newfoundland to reassemble those helicopters, but it was really one engineer, and I don't remember his name, who figured out how to cut the hole in the front to put the litter in so they could bring it up and then create a safe place to store it while the helicopter flew away. And again, he had to think about this within hours, literally
Yeah.
hours of all of this taking place so that they could get these people out of the elements that had been there for several days at this point. It really took, all in all, it took about a week to completely clear out the site and get the dead buried. And then, of course, they still had to go in and do their full investigation to
Right.
find out what happened. But really, what they think happened, because the weather was so foul, the pilot and his team couldn't see this other field where they were told to land. And eventually, in their search for it, they just ran out of fuel and went down.
Well, you can see behind you how thick and wooded it is.
Yeah. And there was reports of when they did start to figure out kind of which direction to go to follow it, they could kind of see a trail of where it had hit trees first, that, the trees had been broken off and kind of left this trail. So then they knew they were going in the right direction.
Mhm.
But it was still, and even to this day, I know I see, sometimes I will post pictures on our social media of like our um, mining cemeteries that are more
Yeah.
overgrown now and stuff, because those communities don't really exist anymore, or they're very small. So there's nobody to be a constant caretaker for these cemeteries. And this is another one of those cases. This is such a remote location, and still very remote location, that it's not something that's easily gotten to. Now, I will say these two pictures that we're showing you, they are from, I was able to pull these from Find a Grave, and they were taken in 2022. So they're
Oh,
fairly recent photos.
yeah.
And there one of the articles I read that was written in the 70s, kind of commemorating this whole thing. There was a gentleman there that once a year, but he was, at this point, he was 60 something years old. He would once a year go into the cemetery and try and clear out some of the brush and maintain the site. And I think there's been others since then that have tried to do the same thing. But again, you have to be willing to spend some time out in the woods to get there. There's not just like a path that easily leads up to the cemetery and the site.
So
So
what year is your picture from?
both of these pictures that we're showing now on our YouTube are from 2022. So they're just 2 years old.
So somebody has definitely been up there, because that would have been, if nobody had been up there, say, since in even 5, 6, 10 years, you would not be able to see the crosses. So if somebody's up
No,
there taking care
somebody's
of.
going up there at least, I think, on an annual basis to clean it up
Mhm.
and maintain it. And I'm not exactly sure. I was having trouble finding out when the memorial that's behind you was actually placed. There was, I did see a link that went on about the 70th anniversary of it. And so I don't know if that was closer to when that was placed or whatever, but I can't find a date on the memorial itself based on the pictures that I can see. So I'm not exactly sure when that was placed. So if somebody has been to the cemetery and knows a little bit more about it, especially maybe our Canadian listeners,
Yeah.
maybe you can tell us when that particular memorial was added to the site. I think the crosses were added almost immediately, because there's older photos of the one caretaker that I was talking about, of him maintaining the site, and those crosses are there. So I think those crosses were put in right away, but I'm not sure when the rest of that was added, and I was having a hard time finding a date for that. Um, but yeah, so it's a very tragic story, but there's actually a lot of good things that came out of it. The survivors, and I'll again put the links in. There's several stories that were done on different survivors, that were willing to be interviewed later on after they'd kind of been able to process what had happened to them and everything. And of course, those that had survived were extremely grateful to get out of there, except there was one gentleman, and I don't remember seeing his name. Both his wife and his daughter perished. And so
Mhm.
he had to be convinced to leave the site because his whole family
He
was
wanted to
there
stay there.
and he was the only one who survived. So, but still grateful in a way that because this tragedy happened, we figured out how to save more lives in the future.
Well, I
So,
think it's amazing that the people in the community came together to
mm,
assist, just to help in what they can, instead of just sitting back. Oh, the doctors will take care of it. They have, people stepped up to help in any way that they possibly could, which is just amazing.
yeah, it was, yeah, I mean, it was the military and the doctors. And I do think, if I remember right, Newfoundland's Coast Guard was actually founded as a result of this particular accident. Well, because they, again, figured out how to improve rescue services in this area for situations like this. And so it helped them to develop that Coast Guard. I think I saw a link for that. So very tragic situation. And I was like, I hate telling these tragic stories sometimes, but also there's so much good that came out of this particular tragedy that I felt like we had to share it. The thing that hit me the hardest, though, was the fact that some of these folks had survived the Holocaust only to die in this plane crash, or even to survive the plane crash. So it was just one more really tragic event in their lives that they had to learn to move on from and get over so that they could continue to live their lives going forward. But some of them were still very successful. I was trying to find more stories about individual survivors, and I think I'd love to, in a future episode, cover some of them a little bit more. It won't be the next couple of weeks because we actually have some guests lined up, but maybe we can revisit some of these survivors later on down the road and what they went on to do after all of this happened.
Well, yes, it's tragic, but then I didn't know about this crash until today. And and then it keeps their memory alive. And I'm looking forward to learning more about the people who survived so much, including this accident.
And it's important to remember because, again, this happened before the air travel became as popular as it was, but it was only a few short years later that air travel exceeded those numbers we mentioned at the beginning of the episode between boats and trains. So it allowed the engineers, the people that went and investigated the site, to figure out things that they could add to airplanes to try and make them safer and to try and avoid accidents like this. So things with the instrument panels, things with how the things land, things with the fuel system so that it doesn't explode necessarily on impact.
Right.
All kinds of things. And, it's accidents. Unfortunately, every time there's an accident like this, somebody has to go in and investigate it. But also what comes out of that every time is how we can do it better so that we save more lives. And so, yes, we lost 27 lives in this accident, but it probably also helped to save so many more lives going forward because we learned from a lot of things from this and the research from this.
Well, and then shortly after that, we were in another war. So
never ending.
Never ending. Exactly.
Never ending, unfortunately. So this is our episode for today. Like I said, next week we have a guest lined up. We will be talking with Tui, who was on a couple months ago, I'm sorry, but she is going to tell us all about that fabulous tour that she was giving in Italian cemeteries. So we'll get to hear some of her stories from that trip and about the Italian cemeteries, which have some fabulous monuments and artwork in them that inspired some of what we see in our American cemeteries, but it's just so different because you have those Italian artists creating so much beauty.
Yes. That's what we were going to do. We were going to drink wine with Tui on the show.
That's right. So make sure you stay tuned for next week. And again, if you know any additional information about this, there wasn't a ton of information. There was a site for the Historical Society for the airport, which is where I got a lot of the information. And it was nice because they did have links to some of the radio recordings, some of the other articles that were published more closely to the time it happened, and some other information. But other than what they've managed to compile, there's not a lot online that's available about this particular accident, which is why I think it's not as well known as some other plane accidents. But I think it's a very important one because, again, it was one of the very first commercial plane accidents that happened, and we lost a lot of lives to it. So,
well, it's so remote. Yeah, it's so remote. It's not like people are constantly visiting and then sharing pictures and everything else. So
right.
It's sort of, I don't say forgotten. I don't want to say forgotten, but it's more difficult to get to it.
Right. So people aren't just going to the cemetery all the time in this case.
Exactly.
So
we thank you for taking time to join us today for this ordinary, extraordinary chat. To learn more about today's discussion, please visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you will find additional links in our show notes. And if you're watching us on YouTube, Be sure to give us a like and subscribe to our channel, the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery Podcast. This really helps makes us more visible to others on YouTube who may also enjoy our podcast.
And please don't forget to visit us on social media, where we share all kinds of cemetery photos, quotes, tidbits, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, and on X at Ord Extra Sim. So ORDEXTRACEM. If you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, please consider leaving a 5-star review and a comment on Apple's podcast, Spotify, or directly on our website. You can also leave those same comments on YouTube. Your positive reviews and enthusiasm for our show help others who love cemeteries and history to discover us and all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories. And if you're feeling extra generous and want to help support the podcast in a financial way, you can now buy Dianne and I a cup of coffee, either through YouTube or on our website. Simply click on the coffee cup icon and it will allow you to make a donation.
Until we meet again.